Francesca Boone's cough echoed sharply off the glossy elevator walls, catching the attention of the only other occupant, a man in a tailored navy blue suit, watching the numbers light up above the doors like he had somewhere far more important to be. She pressed a fist to her chest, trying and failing to hold back another cough. "Hey, are you all right?" His voice was deep, calm, and laced with concern. She nodded quickly, cheeks flaming. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a tickle." He reached inside his leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek metal water bottle. "Here," he said, holding it out. "It's sealed. I haven't used it." Francesca hesitated. Her throat burned. It felt like a cactus had taken up residence in her windpipe, and she was about to hack up a lung in front of this stranger. She took it. "Thanks," she croaked, unscrewing the lid and taking a long sip. He gave a small smile. "Better." "A little," she said, capping the bottle and clutching it like a lifeline. "Thank you." "Seriously." The elevator dinged at the 20th floor, and she stepped back to let him out. He didn't move. "My floor's higher," he said, then after a beat, "You work here." "I'm interviewing, actually, for a receptionist position in the finance group." He raised an eyebrow. "Tough place. Good luck." The elevator stopped again. This time it was her floor. "Keep the water," he said, just as the doors slid open. She blinked. "Really?" He nodded, then added with a warm tilt of his mouth. "You'll need it if you're talking to Gregson. He never stops grilling people." Francesca laughed weakly. "Great. Looking forward to that." She stepped off, still holding the bottle, as the doors shut behind her. What she didn't know was that the man in the elevator was Kellan Nash, founder and CEO of Nash Capital, a millionaire, and the one person who could have hired her with a single call. But he didn't tell her that. Not yet. Francesca didn't get the receptionist job. She got something else entirely. 3 days later, an assistant from Nash Capital called her out of nowhere and offered her a temporary consulting position in the marketing division. Higher pay. Better floor. No interview. She almost dropped the phone. "I didn't even apply to that department," she said, stunned. "Mr. Nash personally recommended you," the assistant said. Francesca stared at the blank wall of her studio apartment, heart racing. "I'm sorry, who?" "Kellan Nash." She frowned. The name was vaguely familiar. Until it wasn't. The elevator guy. Water bottle guy. Holy crap. When she walked into Nash Capital on Monday morning, the first face she saw in the hallway was his. Kellan. He was leaning against the glass wall of the marketing division, talking to 2 sharply dressed men. His eyes lifted and locked with hers instantly, like he'd been waiting. She stopped walking. So did he. Kellan stepped away from the men and walked toward her slowly, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Francesca, right?" he asked. "I." She swallowed hard. "Yes, I didn't realize you were." Kellan grinned. "The guy who gives strangers water in elevators?" "No, the CEO." He shrugged. "I liked the first one better." She laughed, a little breathless. "Why me?" "You didn't panic. You didn't apologize for coughing. You just handled it. And then you thanked me like someone who's used to doing things on her own." Her eyes narrowed. "You hired me because I coughed with confidence?" He chuckled. "I hired you because I liked your energy. And because you didn't look at me like I was a walking dollar sign." Francesca glanced down, trying not to smile. "Well, now that I know you are." He tilted his head. "You going to look at me differently?" She looked up. "No, but I might keep the water bottle forever." "Good," he said, voice dropping just slightly. "Keep it." By the end of the week, Francesca had learned 3 things. 1. Nash Capital was full of sharks, but Kellan was nothing like them. 2. She was in way over her head, but somehow floating. And 3. Kellan Nash was trouble. He stopped by her desk more than once a day, sometimes to check in, sometimes just to give her a coffee. Once he brought her a croissant and didn't even say anything, just set it on her desk and walked away. And every time he left, her heart raced like she'd run a mile. "Why does the CEO keep bringing you pastries?" her coworker Zoe whispered one morning. "I have no idea," Francesca whispered back, blushing furiously. But she did have an idea. She just didn't want to admit it yet. One rainy evening, Francesca stayed late to finish a presentation. The building emptied out. Her screen glowed in the dark office. And then footsteps. She turned, startled. It was Kellan. "Still here?" he asked, voice low. I'm almost done. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets. You hungry? She blinked. A little. Come with me. Francesca hesitated. I'm not asking as your boss, he added. I'm asking as the guy who gave you water in an elevator. She bit her lip, then grabbed her coat. All right. Let's go. He took her to a rooftop restaurant with a view of the whole city. Private dining. Glass walls. A string quartet in the corner. She stared at the place like she'd walked into a movie. You brought me here? She whispered. You said you were hungry. This place probably costs more than my rent. Kellan looked at her, serious. Francesca, I don't care about that. She sat slowly, her heart thudding. The waiter brought wine, then truffle risotto, then filet mignon. She barely tasted anything, because Kellan was looking at her like she was the only person in the world. And when dessert came, chocolate mousse with gold flakes, he reached across the table, took her hand, and said, I haven't stopped thinking about you since the elevator. Francesca froze. I know I'm your boss, and this is probably the worst idea ever, Kellan continued, voice rougher now. But I don't care. I'm not going to pretend this is nothing. She stared at him, stunned. Say something, he murmured. I haven't stopped thinking about you either, she whispered. He exhaled, then smiled like he just won something huge. I was hoping you'd say that. And right there, under the twinkling lights of the rooftop, Francesca realized something crazy. She was falling for Kellan Nash. Hard. Francesca nearly forgot how to breathe when Kellan kissed her that night. It wasn't planned. It didn't feel like a first date. It felt like the inevitable collision of two people who'd been circling something dangerous, and finally gave in. He didn't ask. He just leaned in slowly, like he was testing gravity, and when their lips met, she felt the world tilt. After the kiss, he walked her to a waiting car parked discreetly at the curb, the kind with leather seats and a driver who didn't speak unless spoken to. She wasn't sure what stunned her more, the kiss or the way he tucked her hair behind her ear and told her to text him when she got home safe. She couldn't sleep that night. Not from nerves, not from confusion, just the overwhelming awareness that something irreversible had happened. Everything that came next would be because of that kiss. The next morning at work, she kept her head down. She was afraid the entire office could see it written across her face. The kiss, the dinner, the way Kellan Nash had looked at her like she was a choice he'd already made. But when she walked into the marketing suite, her computer screen blinked with a calendar update. One-on-one strategy session. Conference room 12. Noon. The meeting wasn't on anyone else's schedule. At exactly noon, she opened the door to the glass-walled room. Kellan was already there. Alone. He didn't speak until she closed the door behind her. I wanted to make sure last night didn't feel like a mistake this morning, he said. She met his gaze. It didn't. He gestured to the chair across from him. Good. Because I don't plan on pretending otherwise. As she sat, he leaned forward, elbows on the table. I know this could become complicated, he said, but I'm not going to pretend I'm indifferent. I'd rather be honest with you than careful with everyone else. She folded her hands in her lap. You're not worried about what people will say? I'm only worried about what you'll think. She let that sit between them. The air felt too still. I don't want to be a secret, she said eventually. You won't be. His voice was steady. She believed him. They didn't touch, didn't flirt, didn't linger when the meeting ended. But when she returned to her desk, her heart was still racing. That afternoon, she received an email with no subject and a single sentence inside. Dinner. 7. My driver will pick you up. He never signed it. She didn't need him to. The car brought her to a house perched high above the city's lights, where the driveway curved into a gated courtyard and a fountain sparkled under soft white lights. A chef greeted her at the door. Not a host. A chef. The dining room opened into a wall of windows that overlooked the skyline. There were no other guests. Just a table set for two, with a bottle of wine already breathing. Kellan entered from the hallway. No tie this time. Shirt sleeves rolled up, watch glinting under the chandelier. I was going to take you out, he said. But I decided I wanted you here instead. She stepped inside, unsure where to look. This is your house? It's one of them. Francesca turned slowly, taking in the white marble floors, the grand piano in the corner, the art that looked like it belonged in a museum. "I'm trying not to look impressed," she said. "Don't," he replied. "I want you to know exactly who I am." She met his eyes. "And who is that?" "A man who already knows he wants more than one night with you." Dinner was flawless. The food was plated like art, the wine crisp and expensive. They talked about childhood, not careers. She told him she used to draw fashion sketches in the margins of her school notebooks. He told her he used to sneak into hotel bars with a fake ID and study how businessmen negotiated. "You were that kid?" she said, laughing. He nodded. "I watched them close deals over bourbon. I learned more in those bars than I did in business school." "You went to business school?" "I dropped out after 6 months." She blinked. "Seriously, I had already started my first company. School didn't make sense anymore." She sat back, quietly stunned. "You don't sound like someone who failed out." "I don't fail," he said, not arrogantly, just as a fact. She didn't ask how many companies he'd started. She didn't ask how much he was worth. It didn't matter. He belonged to a world that operated on a level she couldn't touch, but he wasn't using it to impress her. He was using it to let her in. After dessert, they walked out onto the terrace. The city glowed below them like a jewel box spilled across velvet. Kellan leaned on the railing beside her, his arm brushing hers. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Francesca didn't hesitate. "How I got here." He turned his head. "Regret it?" "No. But it feels like I stepped into someone else's life." He reached for her hand. "Maybe it's just your life now." She looked down at their hands. His grip was strong, certain. Her fingers trembled slightly inside his. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Neither do I. But I want to figure it out with you." She nodded slowly. "Okay." He kissed her again, softer this time, slower. But just as certain. When he pulled back, he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The car took her home after midnight. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't want to ruin the spell. But the next morning, the spell cracked. She walked into a meeting and saw Marla Whitmore, the director of corporate strategy, standing in front of the conference table with a stack of reports. Marla was sharp, quick-witted, and universally feared. She also happened to be Kellan's ex. Francesca hadn't known that until Zoe whispered it across the coffee station 2 days prior, like it was a state secret. Now, Marla's eyes flicked to Francesca with the kind of calculation that made it clear she knew. "Glad you could join us," Marla said, voice tight with control. Francesca took her seat. She didn't flinch. Didn't react. She refused to give Marla the satisfaction. After the meeting, Marla cornered her by the elevator. "I hope you're enjoying your new role," she said, voice low. Francesca didn't blink. "I am. Thank you." Marla leaned in slightly. "Just remember, nothing in this building stays private for long. Not even rooftop dinners." Francesca held her gaze. "That's good to know." She walked away before Marla could respond. Later that night, she told Kellan everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked out the window of the penthouse where they'd ended up, another one of his homes. This one overlooking the harbor. "I should have warned you," he said. "No," she replied. "You shouldn't have to." He turned back to her. "I don't want you to feel like you're walking into a battlefield." "I'm not afraid of her," she said. "But I need to know that if this becomes public, you won't flinch." Kellan crossed the room and cupped her face in his hands. "Francesca," he said, "if anyone tries to come between us, they'll have to go through me first." Her breath caught. "All right?" she whispered. That night, as they stood on the balcony, her head resting against his chest, she realized something else. She wasn't just falling for him. She was already his. And that terrified her more than anything. The invitation arrived wrapped in thick ivory cardstock, with her name printed in bold calligraphy. Francesca turned it over in her hands, her fingers hesitating at the weight of the envelope alone. She'd barely had time to process the gold-embossed logo in the corner before Zoe leaned over her desk. "You got one too?" Zoe whispered, eyes wide with barely contained disbelief. "The Nash Foundation Gala? That's like royalty only." Francesca's throat tightened. "I thought it was for board members and donors." "It is, and you're neither, which means someone wants you there." Francesca didn't need to ask who. That evening, a package waited for her at her apartment door. Inside was a gown the color of midnight, folded into silk tissue and accompanied by a simple note. Where this? I'll be waiting. No name. Just handwriting she recognized immediately. She stared at the dress, realization sinking deeper than it had before. This wasn't just attraction anymore. This was Kellan placing her in his world, a world that sparkled on the outside but pulsed with power on the inside, and daring her to walk into it beside him. The night of the gala, she was met at the curb by a vintage Rolls-Royce. She stepped inside, feeling like she'd slipped into a scene she wasn't sure she belonged in. But when the doors of the ballroom opened and Kellan turned toward her, dressed in a tuxedo with his hair swept back and his gaze locked on her like she was the only person who existed, that doubt vanished. He crossed the floor without hesitation, ignoring the stares, the whispers, even the photographers who lingered near the entrance. His hand slid around her waist with ease, but his voice was low and careful. "You look like you were made for this." Her pulse danced high in her throat. "I'm not sure I belong here. You do now." Before she could argue, he led her into the center of the room. Chandeliers glittered above them and a string ensemble played music that felt like it belonged to another century. "I've never been to anything like this," she whispered as they began to move in sync with the music. "It's just a room," he replied. "You make it worth walking into. People watch them." She could feel it in the tension that laced the air. But Kellan didn't flinch, didn't even glance away. His hand stayed firm at her back, his palm burning through the silk like a brand. Halfway through the night, a man approached them near the donation table. Older, silver-haired, with a pinched face and a glass of scotch that sloshed slightly in his grip. "You've been hiding her," he said to Kellan, his voice slick with condescension. "She's not one of ours, is she?" Francesca stiffened. Kellan's grip didn't change. "She's not anyone's," he replied calmly. "But she's with me." The man gave a thin smile. "Well, this crowd can be particular. Then they can learn to adjust." The man gave a shrug, then drifted off. Kellan turned to her, his jaw tense. "You all right?" She nodded, but her voice was quiet. "I think I just got told I don't belong." Kellan glanced after the man, then leaned closer. "You belong because I say you do, and I don't say that lightly." She searched his face, trying to read the undercurrent of something harder there. "How many times have people tried to tear you down? Enough to stop listening." They didn't speak of it again. But the rest of the night, he didn't leave her side. When she stepped away to get some air, he followed. When she returned, he was waiting. When he led her outside under the stars, his hand never once let go. In the early hours of the morning, back at the townhouse, she sat curled on his velvet sofa with her heels discarded and his jacket draped over her shoulders. He poured them both whiskey and joined her, pressing his thigh against hers. "I need to ask you something," he said, setting his glass down. She tipped her head. "Anything. Not now, but soon." Her chest tightened. "That sounds ominous." "It isn't. It's just—" He ran a hand through his hair, the first sign of hesitation she'd seen in him. "There's a part of my life I haven't shown you yet, and I need you to see it before I ask for more." "More?" Kellan didn't answer. He just looked at her like he already knew what he was going to say when the time came. 3 days later, he flew her to upstate New York on a helicopter without telling her why. "Trust me," was all he said when she stepped onto the pad beside him. She didn't ask questions. She just followed him. They landed on a sprawling estate surrounded by woods that caught the sun in golden shards. It wasn't a mansion. It was a home. Older. Stone walls. Ivy climbing the sides. A porch swing moved in the breeze. "Where are we?" she asked as they crossed the gravel path. "My parents' house." She stopped walking. "Wait, what?" "They're not here. Haven't been for years. But this is where I grew up." Francesca turned slowly, taking it in. "It's nothing like I expected. Most of my life isn't." He led her through the front door and into a kitchen with mismatched chairs and a wall covered in pencil marks tracking someone's height. He didn't point to them. He didn't say a word. But she knew. He took her upstairs, through a hallway lined with fading photographs. In one, a boy with dark hair stood in front of a lemonade stand. In another, a teenager held a chess trophy with a crooked smile. She paused in front of the last photo. "You look so serious." "I had just lost for the first time." "What happened?" "I learned how to win better." They sat on the back porch for hours. He told her about summers spent fixing engines with his uncle. About a dog named Max who ran away and came back a week later with someone's wallet in his mouth. About the first time he realized money could either chain you or free you depending on who held it. She didn't speak much. She just listened, letting the pieces of him settle into place. As the sun began to fall behind the trees, he stood and pulled something from his pocket. A key. I've never given anyone this before, he said. She stared at it, her breath faltering. What does it open? The front door. And the rest of it. He placed it in her hand, closing her fingers around it. I don't expect an answer now. But I don't want to waste time pretending this is casual. She looked up at him, heart hammering against her ribs. Are you asking me to move in? No, he said. I'm asking you to start thinking about what comes after that. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was weighty, full of all the things she couldn't say yet. But she didn't let go of the key. That night, as they flew back to the city, she sat beside him with her head against his shoulder. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be walking into it alone. A week after Francesca closed her fingers around the key to Kellan's childhood home, the world around them cracked open. It started with the leak. A photo, blurry but unmistakable. Kellan's hand at her back as they exited a private restaurant. Her in heels and a navy coat. Him in a charcoal suit, no tie, hair tousled from wind. The caption. Nash's mystery woman, who is she? She saw it on Zoe's phone first. She didn't say anything at the time, just handed it back, face unreadable. But the second she stepped into Kellan's penthouse that night, she tossed her bag on the counter and turned toward him. How did they find us? Kellan didn't flinch. He was standing at the stove, sleeves rolled up, steam rising from a pot behind him. We were followed. I didn't notice. She crossed her arms. You always notice. I was focused on you. There was a silence. Not hostile. Just taut. She walked over slowly, eyes locked on his. Do you have a PR team handling it? They tried. But I shut it down. She blinked. Why? Because I didn't want you buried behind a press release. I wanted people to see your face and know I chose you. She stared at him. I'm not afraid of being seen, Francesca. He wasn't. That much she knew. But she wasn't thinking about the press. She was thinking about her parents. She hadn't told them anything. Not about Kellan. Not about the key. Not about the fact that she was standing in a penthouse with a man who'd become her entire future before she even had time to catch her breath. Her mother called the next day. Francesca almost didn't answer. But she did. There was a pause on the other end. Then, you're really dating Kellan Nash? Francesca held the phone tighter. Yes. You didn't think that was worth mentioning? I didn't know how to explain it yet. Her mother exhaled. We saw the papers. Your father nearly choked on his toast. Francesca closed her eyes. I'm still me. Just. In a different place. There was another silence. Then, is he good to you? Yes. Does he make you feel like you're enough? She hesitated for the first time. More than enough. That evening, she told Kellan she wanted to go home. Not to the townhouse. Not to the penthouse. To her parents' house. The one with the lopsided porch and the broken screen door and the kitchen table that had seen every argument and every apology she'd ever known. He didn't argue. He drove her himself. They parked out front, the car an obvious sore thumb among the weathered sedans lining the block. Francesca stepped out first. Kellan followed, hands in his pockets, gaze steady. Her mother answered the door before they could knock. She looked smaller than Francesca remembered. Or maybe Francesca had just grown. Hi, Mom. Her mother looked at her, then at Kellan. Then stepped aside. They sat at the kitchen table. Kellan didn't speak first. He didn't try to impress. He just listened. When her father asked what his intentions were, he didn't even blink. I intend to build a life with your daughter. But only if she wants it. He said it like a promise. Nothing showy. Just truth. After dinner, as they stood outside under the porch light, Francesca leaned into him. That could have gone worse. He looked down at her. It could have gone better. They didn't throw anything. That's not really a metric I use. She laughed, and the sound felt like it belonged in the air between them. 2 days later, she returned to the office to find whispers louder than usual. People didn't try to hide them anymore. She passed Marla near the elevator, and the woman didn't even bother with a smile. Enjoying the spotlight, she asked, voice icy. Francesca didn't stop walking. It's brighter than you warned me. That night, she told Kellan she was leaving Nash Capital. He didn't try to dissuade her. You were right, she said. I walked into this job on your name. I want to know what it feels like to stand on my own. He nodded. I understand. I want to build something that no one can take credit for except me. Kellan stepped closer. Then I'll help you. Quietly. Or not at all. Your choice. She smiled. You'll always be part of the reason I even believed I could. He kissed her then, slow and deep, like he was anchoring himself to the moment. 3 months passed. In that time, she launched a boutique creative agency, small, agile, hers. She built a team, took on her first client, signed her first retainer contract, paid her own rent. Kellan watched from the sidelines, never interfering. But sometimes she'd find a bouquet on her desk after a win, or a reservation at a restaurant she hadn't booked herself. He never said it was him, but she knew. One evening, she returned to their shared apartment, the one they'd picked together, halfway between her new office and his, only to find the lights off, a single path of candles leading to the rooftop. She climbed the stairs slowly, heart thudding. Kellan stood at the far end, the city behind him, the wind tossing his coat open. In his hands, a small velvet box. She didn't stop walking. He didn't speak right away. Just opened the box. Inside was a ring, oval cut, set in gold, with a band so delicate it looked like it belonged to a different era. He looked up. I knew the moment I handed you that water bottle. Her breath caught. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know you'd change everything I thought I understood about love, about partnership, about what I actually wanted. Kellan, I don't care about cameras or critics or old flames or boardrooms. I care about you. And I want to build something that can't be bought or sold. I want to build a life with you. He dropped to one knee. Francesca Boone, will you marry me? She didn't cry. She laughed. Because it felt too big, too beautiful, too right to reduce to tears. Yes, she said, gripping his hands. Yes, I will. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They didn't go back downstairs. They stayed up there, above the city, wrapped in each other. The wedding was held 4 months later at his family estate, where she'd first held the key he'd given her. Only now it wasn't symbolic. It was hers. The ceremony was small. No cameras. Just family. Friends. And a sky so blue it looked painted. Zoe stood beside her, grinning through her vows. Her parents cried openly. Kellan whispered something into her ear before the kiss that she never repeated to anyone. But she never forgot it. They danced in the backyard under strings of lights, barefoot by midnight, cake smeared across his cheek, her dress grass-stained and perfect. He picked her up without warning, carried her into the house, and kicked the door shut behind them. You're not going to say anything corny, are you? She whispered. He set her down gently. No. But I reserve the right to be completely ridiculous when we're 80. She smiled. Deal. They didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, she woke up to find his arm draped over her waist, his breathing slow and even. She turned to face him. I still can't believe I coughed in that elevator, she whispered. Without opening his eyes, he murmured, best cough of my life. She laughed, pressing her forehead to his. And just like that, the future began bright, loud, and theirs. The first real fight came 6 weeks into their marriage. Francesca stood barefoot on the cool kitchen tiles, holding a manila envelope she hadn't expected to find in their mail stack. Her name was scrawled across the front in rushed handwriting. No return address. Inside were copies of tabloid articles, some old, some recent, all highlighting Kellan's past relationships in excruciating detail. One photo showed him on a yacht with a model whose name Francesca didn't recognize. Another had him at an art gala with someone who looked like she belonged in a Bond film. There was no note, no explanation, just a single red circle around the date on a headline that read, Nash seen with heiress 2 weeks before breakup with Whitmore. She tucked the envelope under her arm and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Kellan was in his office reading through a stack of acquisition reports. He glanced up when she entered. Hey, he said, pushing his chair back. Something wrong. She tossed the envelope onto his desk. He didn't flinch. Just opened it, scanned the contents, and set it down. I figured it would happen eventually, he said. Her voice was quiet but sharp. So you knew someone would send me this? I didn't know who, but yes. She crossed her arms. And you weren't going to say anything? I didn't think it mattered anymore. Francesca blinked, stunned. You didn't think it mattered that someone went out of their way to drag your past into our present? He stood slowly, his eyes narrowing, not in anger but control. I don't care what they say. I care about what you believe. That's not the point. Then what is? She stepped back, her breath catching. The point is that I didn't build this relationship on silence. I need to know that if someone tries to knock us down, you won't just let them. His jaw ticked. Do you think I'm letting them? I think you're used to fighting alone. He looked at her for a long moment. You're right, he said finally. I am. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then he crossed the room and rested his hands on her shoulders. I've spent years building walls so nothing could reach me. But I married you because I wanted to tear them down. I just don't always know how. Francesca reached up, threading her fingers through his. Then start with this. Don't protect me by leaving me out. Protect me by letting me in. He nodded once. All right. From now on, full access. Every corner. That night, he handed her his phone without her asking. His laptop. His inbox. Not because she demanded it, but because trust meant nothing if it only flowed one way. She never opened any of it. She just needed to know the door existed. Later that week, they attended a charity gala for a medical initiative Kellan had funded through one of his quieter ventures. Francesca wore a rich emerald gown with pleated sleeves and a neckline that drew every eye in the room. But her gaze was fixed on the woman approaching them just before dinner began. Marla. Her hair was shorter now, her dress a shade of crimson that felt deliberate. She extended a hand to Francesca first. You wore the ring, she said. Francesca didn't hesitate. And I'll be wearing it for the next 50 years, if that's what you were wondering. Marla gave a tight nod. I came to say congratulations. Francesca tilted her head. That's unexpected. I don't lose sleep over things that weren't meant for me. Kellan stepped forward then, his hand settling naturally at Francesca's waist. You didn't have to come. I know, Marla said. But it's better than pretending I don't care. Francesca held her gaze. Do you? Marla's mouth lifted at the corner. Not in the way I used to. She walked away before either of them could respond. Kellan turned to Francesca. You didn't flinch. She's not a threat. No, he said, watching her. She's not. They danced later that night, not because protocol demanded it, but because Kellan pulled her into the center of the floor without asking. The music swelled. Her heels pressed against his shoes. And for a moment, they weren't CEO and entrepreneur or public figures under scrutiny. They were just two people who kept choosing each other. Afterward, as they walked through Central Park at midnight with his tux jacket around her shoulders, she turned to him and said, I want you to meet someone. He raised an eyebrow. You're not about to introduce me to a secret twin, are you? No. But I want you to meet my mentor. The woman who convinced me I was worth something before anyone else did. He stopped walking. Then let's go now. She lives in Boston. Then we'll go tomorrow. They drove up the next day in his vintage convertible with the top down and the wind wrecking both their hair. Francesca's mentor, a retired fashion editor named Celeste, lived in a converted warehouse filled with books instead of furniture. She wore scarves like armor and could read a person's energy in 7 seconds flat. She took one look at Kellan and said, You're the one with the empire. He didn't blink. I'm the one who almost didn't deserve her. Celeste turned to Francesca. He's got the eyes of someone who's lost before. That's good. Keeps a man honest. They stayed for hours. Celeste asked sharp questions. Kellan answered without flinching. And when they left, she hugged Francesca so long it nearly broke something open in her chest. As they drove back into the city, Kellan reached over and laced their fingers together. You've got good people. I've got the best person sitting next to me. He kissed the back of her hand without letting go. Spring turned to summer. The agency Francesca built landed a contract with an international brand. Kellan surprised her with a private rooftop dinner the night she signed it, complete with a string quartet and a chef she'd once mentioned in passing, 3 months earlier. He remembered everything. She surprised him 2 weeks later with a framed photo of the lemonade stand from his childhood, the one she'd taken from the wall of his family home and had restored by a conservator. I wanted you to remember who you were before the world decided you were a headline. Kellan stared at it for a long time. Then he kissed her like it was the only answer he could give. They stopped caring who was watching. They walked through markets hand in hand, took weekend trips without disguises, and bought a lakeside cabin just because it reminded Francesca of a painting she used to dream about when she was 10. One rainy Thursday, Kellan came home late, soaked through, holding a small box. She raised an eyebrow. I saw this in a gallery window, he said. brushing hair from her cheek. It made me think of you. Inside was a necklace, thin gold chain, holding a charm shaped like a key. You gave me a real one, she said, voice soft. This one's for everything else you've opened. She wore it every day after that. 1 year later, they stood on the balcony of their cabin, watching the lake ripple under a lavender sky. Francesca leaned into him, eyes half closed. You know what we should do? Kellan kissed her temple. Tell me. Disappear for a month. No press. No planners. No meetings. Just you, me, and a reason to forget what time it is. He smiled. I'll cancel everything. She turned to face him, fingers curling into his shirt. You'd really do that? For you? Always. He didn't just cancel. He bought out a private island resort for 30 days and had a custom itinerary written entirely in her favorite poetry quotes. She cried when she saw it. He didn't mock her for it. He just pulled her into his arms and whispered something only she would understand. Years passed. They built more than a life, they built a legacy. Not just in business, but in how they loved. Fiercely. Openly. Without apology. Francesca never stopped designing. Kellan never stopped pushing boundaries. They argued. They made up. They kept changing and they kept choosing. One morning, as the sun rose over the city they once tried to keep at arm's length, Francesca woke to find Kellan watching her with a quiet smile. What? She asked, stretching. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I still see you. She leaned in and kissed him, slow and sure. I still see you too. And for as long as they lived, that never changed.